I think one person who is the best at humanizing people is Donald Trump, man.
No, seriously, that's one thing that people overlook because I think that's why they try to paint him as a Hitler. They try to paint him as pure evil because he always wants to know, who are you? Susan? Susan, you're awesome. And he always tries to point people out. He always tries to talk people up. He tries to find that positive in the people around him. He builds the teams that he does, and love him or hate him, remember, the biggest thing about the Trump organization is everything begins and ends with Trump. So if something goes completely sideways, that was a Trump-approved plan, and it went sideways. And if there's anybody to blame, it's Trump, because he approved it, he directed it. And I think that that's one of the things I respect about him, because I hate a committee. I want a team. I want a team with a team leader who is ultimately accountable for the results of that team. That team leader is responsible for selecting their team members to help them accomplish the goal they've been assigned. A committee is 100% about diluting responsibility and accountability so they can say, well, the committee did the best they could. We all agree that was the best plan, and it didn't work out. Well, whatever. And it waters things down. So I believe in teams accomplishing goals. Committees are for people that avoid accountability.
So, and not to be devil's advocate here, but I think many people who watched, the events of January 6th would look at this as an organized event, right? Especially for me, right? Me and Denton, if you don't know, we met because we have great conversations over the course of probably 5 years, 5 minutes at a time every day. And, for my demographic, and I look at people like Trump, when something that well organized, the only reason why he's probably not going to go to jail over it with January 6th is because he didn't make any money, right? It was not a profitable event.
Right. It was many things. Profitable was not one of them.
He didn't make any, and that's why I think the racketeering and some of those things didn't happen. But would you consider Trump, and I want to use the right word, people who support Trump, or I wouldn't say fans, but Trump supporters, would you consider them a committee or a mob or some of these other synonyms that I've heard people call people who, follow Donald Trump?
And there's another shade of the Trump machine. So the back half, the darker side of the Trump organization and Trump as a person is that Trump is an egomaniac. Literally, we wouldn't be here with Trump-elect if the left had just never mentioned Trump's name again. After the election in 2020, if they just never said the word, we're going to make an agreement. We're never going to say the words Donald Trump ever again. He would have withered away and not had any power. And these people fed back into it, which the January 6th thing really was sort of impetus to that, because that was completely a Trump thing. Trump let his ego get in the way. He went out, he ran off at the mouth, which both sides agree Trump runs his mouth too much, and he ran off at the mouth, and the people that day, well, mob mentality. There's an old saying that says, none of us is as dumb as all of us. And when you got everybody in the one room and you let him shake the ant farm, that day was not going to end well. People forget the security staff at the Capitol shot a woman in the face, shot her straight in the face on camera. Nobody remembers her name. Nobody felt bad for her or the guy that shot her. This poor man who had to make a judgment call to discharge a firearm into a stranger's face, who wasn't being given any information, any guidance in a total chaotic situation. We can't appreciate the miracle that January 6th didn't turn into a Kent State-style massacre. That you didn't have a bunch of hotheads overreacting and firing blindly into a crowd who, in their minds, were protesting an injustice. The fact that one person got shot, that is huge. The fact that it turned more into a circus than a day of death, man, that's the bullet America dodged on that day. And that woman's death and that man or woman who did the shooting who has to live with that for the rest of their lives, both the federal government and Donald Trump are responsible for that. And nobody will ever call them up and say, I'm sorry. They will never have the answers, the closure they need, the family that was ruined, you know? And that was the January 6th tragedy. I think that gets completely just overlooked. That when that's a humanity situation, that's the human element. When you snuff out a human being.
So with that being said, does Trump pardon all of the participants?
Oh, I think he will. I think that's a game move that he has to do at this point to maintain his credibility with his base. And honestly, I think a majority of Americans at this point just have moved on from January 6th. Because you got to remember, when January 6th happened, we were still in the middle of COVID rebuilding. It was chaos. Everybody just wants to move on with their lives. They want to have jobs again. They want to start building a future. They want to see that there might be a future to build. You know, they don't want to have to go buy a car at 30% interest or pay as much for that car as that their parents or younger members of their generation paid for a house. You know, they want to feel that there's possible. They want the opportunity to succeed and fail instead of just fail. You know, and again, I think that's part of what happened. You know, the results of resulted in the election results.
Yeah, because I mean, for me, there's no way in hell I was voting for Kamala.
Right.
I didn't get a primary to make her the choice.
No, absolutely. You know, we were watching videos from 2016, and I said, so let's look at the mirror of 2016. After Obama and Hillary in 2008 had gone to war with each other, it left the Democrat National Committee just completely broken. They were broke. They didn't have any money. They had lost all the energy for that victory for Obama. This resulted in Hillary loaning money to the DNC and buying herself a lot of power. And at that time, within the DNC, they have what's called superdelegates. Republicans have them the same way at the National Convention. The problem was with the way that the DNC was set up at that time, superdelegates outnumbered the delegates. So if every single delegate selected A, the superdelegates could vote B, and B would be the answer. The Democrat Party, the party of the people, the game was rigged. And so what happened is you had two parallel universes. One of them had a candidate that should have been Bernie Sanders, but Hillary had dictated she was going to be the candidate. And so despite what the delegates wanted, she becomes candidate. On the other side of the mirror, you have Trump, who the establishment in the Republican Party did not want to be candidate. They turn around, and the next thing you know, the delegates vote Trump to be the president. And at the end of the day, he becomes the candidate because that's what the Republican Party members, the actual body, wanted. And that resulted in their failure. And we flash forward to 2024, you have a candidate that the people didn't want, and you had a candidate that offered an unknown. Like, there's no plan for fixing World War III, a wrecked economy, and a world that is completely broken. But with Trump, people saw a throw of the dice. And a throw of the dice was better than a candidate that said, I'm going to raise your taxes and tax you on unrealized gains.
Yeah, for me, that's unfair. For anybody in sales who's making some commissioner bonus, it's like, hey, y'all making too much money. And I think that's the funny thing about global politics and American economy is that, they tell us during Trump, they were just riding off of Obama, right? So where are all these unrealized gains that you feel like are the plot to your digging out of the hole, right?
Right.
It's kind of a backwards thing. So let me ask you this. With such strong political views, when did this become an interest of yours? Because you're personally into politics, right?
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. I think it was when I started getting into comedy, so my interest in comedy, so I studied antiquity. I took 4 years of Latin, and one of the things that I had to read was a book that was written in the 30s by a woman named Edith Hamilton, and it was called The Roman Way. And the bigger point of the book, studying Roman culture, was that she said, if you want to know a culture, study their comedy. Because if you study their comedy, you're going to suss out more truth about their culture than you would anywhere else in their writings. Because their comedy often is unfiltered points of view. It's speaking to the things we don't talk about. If you look at comedy, especially in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of racism, that people made these racist jokes that are just kind of tongue-in-cheek, wink, wink, but it was funny because everybody knew that that's how it was. So I get lumped in with white people a lot, but I am a Vietnam War bonus baby. My mother grew up in a mountain village in Thailand. I'm a dual citizen. I answer to a God king as a second half of my duality of who I am. I'm an Asian American. I'm a firstborn generation of my Thai family in the United States. When you get into identity politics, that's playing a lot of cards right there. But I don't get to have that because of, well, the perception of how people see me.
But you know why I didn't? Because of where you live.
Oh, yeah.
In the country. We're in the Midwest.
Yeah, we're in the Midwest, It's just
it's black and white and Mexican. That's all they know.
Yeah, and so as a result, you kind of fall into a crack. And so I try to explain to people that to feel that racism. So this kind of gives you of how different cultures and generations were. When we first moved to Kansas City, we moved with my grandmother. And my grandmother loved me very much. However, she didn't know how to deal with having a half-breed grandchild. And so I would be left with her during the day. And so she would take me with her to the market. We'd get on the bus, go downtown to the department stores, do shopping. One of the very first things she did was she bought me a clown mask because I was interested in I was like, oh, a mask. And she goes, would you like a mask? And so she bought me a clown mask. I never went out without that mask. I was allowed to wear it at the store. I went on the bus. We would go out wearing that mask. And so for me, wearing that costume was just, oh, that's fun. As I got older, that turned into the Lone Ranger. I was given a wooden broom handle horse. I got to wear a cowboy hat and a Lone Ranger outfit. And I wore a mask. And because it avoided questions that my grandmother didn't want to answer. So I was essentially the polite version of being put a gunny sack over my head so that nobody would ask any questions about your half-breed grandson. And that was and also because my mother was Thai, I grew up with my mother, so my English, my accent and how I talked developed very badly. And so early on, they thought I had a learning disability because I stuttered and I mispronounced words because my mother mispronounced words. And so I had to go to special classes to work to convince them that I wasn't special needs and that I could be put in the general population. But that was all because of perception. So I've spent my life trying not to look at what's on the outside, but try to see people for their potential, for what they want, for what the power that's inside of them. Because I would rather have somebody who's only capable of accomplishing 70% of what I need, but is going to give me all 70%, than somebody who's capable of giving me 100%, but only gives me 10%. Because that person's not trying. And so I see people all the time in society, you know, trying to accomplish things and get where they want to be, and there's no fire in them. They aren't trying. They think they are. They think they're fighting for what they believe in, but they're really just being puppets. They're drones. They're NPCs, as the right would call them. And they're right. It's terrifying. Ask somebody, who are you? What do you believe? And watch them suddenly try to dance around the subject. If you hold them to it, if you go, no, are you a coward? I'm not a coward. How are you not a coward? And they'll go in a complete sort of like existential crisis because they don't know who they are.